Montana Territory, June 1883. The train whistle cried sharp through the hot air, and in the dust beyond the platform at the Miles City station, Osiah Boone tipped his hat back and watched the whole mess unfold. She was crying. Not quiet, dignified tears either. Her chest heaved like the breath had been kicked out of her, the white lace of her dress stained with soot and her gloved hands shaking hard. The other passengers gave her wide berth as they stepped off, and a conductor tried not to look too long. Osiah had only come to sell a few hides and pick up a new stirrup for his saddle. He was not a man who got involved in other folks' trouble. But something about the way she stood there lost, heartbroken, and still trying to hold herself upright tugged at something deep in him he thought had dried up years ago. He stepped closer. "Miss? Are you all right?" She blinked up startled, her pale blue eyes red from crying. "No," she whispered. "I'm not." She looked about 22, maybe 23. Her dress was too fine for this place, and Osiah knew right off she was not from here, probably not even from this side of the country. He glanced at the satchel by her feet. "No trunk, no escort. Were you waiting for someone?" She nodded slowly, then shook her head. "I was supposed to be married today. He sent for me from Cincinnati." Her voice broke. "I got off the train and no one came." Osiah felt something tighten in his chest. "You sure he's not just running late?" She lifted a folded paper from her satchel and held it out. The handwriting was clean, formal. "June 20th. I will meet you at the station. We will be married that day. Mr. Henry P. Calloway." Osiah didn't know the man, but he knew a coward when he saw the pieces left behind. She pulled herself straighter. "I waited 3 hours. No one came. A man at the livery says Henry left town 2 days ago." Osiah rubbed his jaw. "That's low. I sold everything I had for this train ticket," she said, chest trembling. "I do not have enough to go back." A silence hung between them. The wind kicked up dust around her boots. Osiah looked at her again, really looked. She had spirit even in the middle of ruin. Her hands had a tremble, but her spine was straight. "What's your name?" he asked. "Grace Waverly." He nodded once. "Osiah Boone." She looked down, ashamed. "I do not expect anything from you, Mr. Boone. I do not know what I am supposed to do now." He hesitated. A broke cowboy with a patched-up coat and a horse that needed new shoes had no business offering anything to a woman like her. But still he thought of the quietness out on his land, the empty table, the nights when he came home and no one was there to notice. "I do not have much," he said, voice low. "But I got a place. It is dry, warm. There's chickens. A milk cow. You would have your own room until you figured out what you want." Grace looked up at him, eyes wide. "Why would you do that for me?" "Because I do not like leaving good folks in the dirt." She studied him for a long moment. He did not flinch or look away. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she whispered. "All right." Osiah's horse, a dun gelding named Flint, pulled the buggy slow across the grasslands. Grace sat beside him, quiet but not stiff. Her hands folded in her lap, her hat pulled low to shield her from the sun. They reached the homestead by dusk. The house was small but sturdy, with a porch that leaned slightly and a barn set back near the creek. A chicken clucked from beneath the porch boards. Grace stepped down carefully, eyes wide. "It's not much," Osiah said, lifting her satchel. "But the roof holds." She turned in a slow circle. "It's beautiful." She meant it. Inside, he showed her the spare room. It had a narrow bed, a quilt his mother had sewn years back, and a small wash basin. "There's fresh water in the pail," he said, setting her things down. "I will give you some time." She caught his hand before he turned. "You do not even know me. Why are you being this kind?" Osiah looked at her hand on his. "Because someone should be." By the second day, she had rolled up her sleeves and started cooking supper before he got in from the field. By the third, she was gathering eggs and humming while sweeping the porch. Osiah watched her from the barn, leaning on the doorframe. She did not cry anymore. But sometimes when she thought he was not looking, she stared off at the hills like she was still waiting for something. On the 7th day, he found her behind the barn, kneeling in the grass. She was crying again, but softer now, like the worst of it had passed. "I thought I was going to be a wife," she whispered as he crouched beside her. I thought I would have children. A home. Osiah reached for her hand. She let him take it. You still can, he said quietly. She looked at him then, the wind lifting strands of her hair. Do you mean here? I do not have gold or fine things, he said. But I would not leave you on a platform. I would not run. She stared at him, searching his face. Do you want a wife? I want someone who wants to stay, he said. If that is you, then yes. Her fingers curled around his. I think I do. That night, she cooked beans and cornbread, and they ate on the porch in the warm dusk. The air smelled like clover and smoke. Osiah leaned back in his chair. You ever handle a horse? Only in books, she said. I will teach you. She smiled. He reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Her breath caught, but she did not pull away. You are not what I expected, she said. Neither are you, he replied. And when the sun dipped low and the crickets began to sing, she leaned her head against his shoulder. For the first time in years, Osiah Boone hoped again. He did not know what would come next, but he knew he wanted her in it. Osiah rose before first light, as he always did. The sky outside the window was still pressed dark against the glass, but he could see the edge of dawn starting to draw itself across the prairie, pale and slow. He moved careful not to wake her. She'd left her door open a crack, and he caught the quiet rhythm of her breathing as he passed by. He saddled Flint in the half-light, the creak of leather and soft snort of the horse filling the barn. His hands worked by instinct, cinch, bit, bridle, and he stepped out into the morning with a bundle of fencing wire slung over one shoulder. The north line had sagged some during the last storm, and he didn't like leaving things half-fixed. By the time he got back, the sun was warming the ground and the scent of something baking came through the kitchen window. His boots were heavy with dust, and his arm ached from pulling wire taut, but he paused at the porch to listen. Grace was singing, low and tuneless, like she wasn't thinking about it. Her voice wasn't polished, but it curled around the walls like it belonged there. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped inside. You weren't in your room, she said, glancing at him over her shoulder. I thought maybe you'd gone into town. Fence line was drooping. Figured I'd better catch it before it gave the calves ideas. She nodded, pulling a tin from the oven. I hope you like biscuits. I do now. She set the tin down and brushed flour from her apron. I used to burn everything. My aunt said I could spoil water without trying. You're doing fine. Grace tilted her head. You always this quiet in the morning? He shook his head once. Just listening. To what? He looked at her for a beat. To the sound of someone in this house. Her hands stilled on the countertop. The moment settled between them, unhurried. I was thinking, she said, her voice softer now. I might try planting something out back. There's a spot near the shed that catches light all day. If it's all right with you. You don't need my permission, Grace. I know, she said, brushing a curl behind her ear, but it's your land. It's ours if you want it. He didn't mean to say it like that, not so plain. But it was out before he could soften it. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she brought over 2 plates and sat across from him. He watched her fingers trace the rim of her mug. I never thought I'd want to stay in a place like this, she said, finally. Flat land, big sky. I always pictured something smaller. Easier. This land's not easy. No, she agreed. But it's honest. They ate in a quiet that didn't feel heavy. Afterward, he went out to see to the cattle and she stayed behind to hang laundry. By noon, the sky was high and clean and the wind had settled down. He found her near the back of the house, kneeling in the grass. She'd cleared a patch, her hands streaked with dirt. You dig that all by yourself? He asked. She looked up and grinned. I'm not made of sugar, Osiah. He crouched beside her. What are you putting in? Carrots, she said. Maybe beans. If they take. He reached over and brushed a smudge of soil from her cheek. She didn't move away. I had a sister once, she said, her voice steady but distant. She planted a row of sunflowers along the fence every spring. Said it made the chickens lay better. He studied her face. Where is she now? Past in childbirth. She kept her eyes on the dirt. Her husband remarried quick. I never blamed him. No woman should have to raise a baby without help. Osiah didn't speak. He didn't need to. Grace sat back on her heels. I thought if I married Henry, I'd get to start over. Be part of something again. She looked at him then. But maybe it's better this way. He nodded slowly. You don't have to rush anything. I'm not rushing. Just thinking. That night, they sat on the porch again, lantern light flickering between them. She brought out a tin of preserved peaches she'd found in the cupboard and handed him a spoon. Do you miss anyone? She asked. He didn't answer at first. Then my brother died out in Wyoming. Fever took him fast. I'm sorry. He was the one who talked me into coming north. Said land was cheaper, grass was better. He was right. Grace shifted closer, her shoulder brushing his arm. You ever think about leaving? Not once. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and this time he rested his hand over hers. Neither of them spoke, but something passed between them in the quiet. A promise not made with words. Something deeper. Something meant to stay. The wind shifted that morning, carrying the scent of wet pine down from the hills. Osiah noticed it while drawing water from the well, the rope course in his hand, the bucket sloshing as it rose. Something about the air felt different, like weather was turning or the land itself had paused to listen. Inside, Grace was mending one of his shirts by the window, her needle moving in slow, careful loops. She'd pulled her hair back with a ribbon she found tucked in an old drawer, and her brow furrowed slightly when she worked, like the thread might tangle if she didn't watch it close. You ever been through a Montana winter? He asked, stepping inside with the pail. No, she said, not looking up. I imagine it's long. He poured the water into the basin. It is, and cruel if you aren't ready. I'm not afraid of cold, she said. But I haven't lived through the kind that comes with silence. He dried his hands on a cloth. It can get quiet enough out here you'd swear the world stopped turning. Grace tied off the thread and bit it with her teeth. Then I'll learn to listen differently. They spent the afternoon sorting through the root cellar. Some jars had cracked from age, others had gone cloudy with time. She lined the shelves with oilcloth while he hauled up limp sacks of potatoes and tossed the spoiled ones to a pile for the pigs. She found a small wooden box tucked deep against the back wall. Inside were dried apple slices wrapped in waxed paper and a folded bit of paper yellowed at the creases. What's this? She asked, handing it to him. Osiah took it slow, unfolding the corners. The paper held a sketch drawn in charcoal, two boys on horseback, one taller, one grinning wide. The taller one held a rifle slung carelessly across his back. My brother drew that, he said, voice low. Grace didn't ask anything more, just set the box down beside the good potatoes and straightened the hem of her sleeve. Later, while he chopped wood, she brought out a kettle and poured him a cup of chicory brew. He took it from her, hands brushing. You always this quiet when you're thinking? She asked. I don't speak what I'm not sure of. Well, she said, settling on the porch rail. I speak when I'm nervous. That's so. I used to read aloud to keep from feeling alone. Books, letters, anything with words. He leaned against the beam. You miss the city? No, she said. But sometimes I miss the sound of footsteps overhead. The noise of someone else's life happening near mine. Osiah looked out toward the pasture. One of the yearlings had wandered close to the fence, tail flicking at flies. Out here, folks only come near when they mean to. Grace folded her hands in her lap. I think I prefer that. That evening, clouds gathered low behind the ridge. By nightfall, wind pressed hard against the windows and the shutters clattered now and then like they weren't sure they'd hold. Grace lit a lamp while Osiah checked the doors, then tossed another log into the stove. You ever get snowed in? She asked. Twice. Once bad enough I had to eat beans for 11 days. She raised an eyebrow. You kept count. Hard not to when they're your only company. She tucked her legs beneath her on the rocker. If we get snowed in this year, I'll bake biscuits every day. That way we'll remember the winter for something better. Osiah sat across from her, boots resting near the stove. Seems I've already got something better to remember it by. She looked at him, and the quiet between them turned warm instead of still. You ever been in love before? She asked, not softly, not shy. He held her gaze. Not until now. Her eyes didn't leave his. Then let's not waste it. He crossed the room in 3 steady steps. She stood before he reached her, and when he touched her cheek, there was no rush, just the sure, slow certainty of something taking root. Their lips met without hesitation, like a promise already made. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside, the lamp burned steady, and neither of them flinched. The first frost came overnight, silvering the grass and laying a quiet hush across the earth. Osiah stepped outside before sunrise, boots crunching against the brittle ground. Grace stood near the chicken coop in her shawl, breath rising in pale curls as she scattered cracked corn from a tin pail. You didn't have to come out, he said, pulling his coat tighter. I couldn't sleep, she replied. The wind kept shifting. He watched her fingers, red from cold but steady. You thinking of something in particular? She stopped scattering feed. I had a dream about a house with 3 rooms and a baby's cradle by the stove. It felt real enough to carry when I woke. He nodded once. You never said if you still wanted children. I didn't know if I should. Things changed so fast. I wasn't sure what was mine to ask for. Osiah stepped closer, the wind tugging at the brim of his hat. You can ask for anything, Grace. That hasn't changed. She looked at him then, steady and sure. Then yes, I do. They went inside before the sun cleared the ridge. Grace warmed her hands by the stove while Osiah ladled oats into bowls. The silence between them was no longer uncertain. It had settled into something companionable, like the space between brushstrokes on a canvas. Later, they drove into town. Supplies were running low, and the iron stovepipe needed patching. Grace rode beside him, a scarf tied beneath her chin, her eyes taking in every tree, every fence line. She'd begun to map the land not just in her mind, but in the way she sat straighter when they passed familiar places. At the general store, she lingered near bolts of muslin and calico, while Osiah bartered for nails and lamp oil. Mr. Barrett, the storekeeper, pushed his glasses up his nose and cleared his throat. Your wife's got a good eye for fabric, he said. Osiah adjusted the crate in his hands. She's not my wife yet. Barrett gave a short nod. Well, if you're waiting for permission, I'd say the whole town's already decided she belongs here. Outside, Grace held a bundle of cloth in her arms, pale lavender threaded with gray. I thought I might try sewing curtains. The light in the front room's too bare. He helped her into the wagon. I think that'd suit the place fine. On the way home, they passed a wagon stalled along the trail, a wheel sunk deep into mud. A man stood beside it, cursing under his breath, while a woman held a bundled child on her hip. Osiah reined Flint to a stop. Need a hand? He called. The man looked up, wary but exhausted. Wheels stuck. I thought we'd make it to Miles City before nightfall. Osiah climbed down. I've got a plank and rope. We can get you out. Grace stepped down beside him, moving toward the woman. You can sit in our wagon for warmth if you like. The wind's picking up. The woman hesitated before nodding. We've been on the trail for days. The baby's got a cough. Grace took the child gently, rocking her against her shoulder while Osiah wedged the plank beneath the wheel. The man grunted as they heaved together, boots sliding in the muck. After 3 tries, the axle lifted free. Much obliged, the man said, wiping his brow. Name's Wilkes. Heading to Bozeman. We've got kin there. Osiah nodded. Safe travels, Wilkes. Back in the wagon, Grace wrapped the cloth around her shoulders. You didn't hesitate. Didn't seem right to pass them by. She looked toward the ridge, where the sky was streaked with copper. That's the kind of man I want to raise a child with. He didn't answer right away, just reached over and took her hand. By the time they reached the homestead, the wind had dropped again and the light had turned soft against the hills. Grace carried the fabric inside and laid it across the kitchen table, smoothing it flat. "I want to be married before snowfall," she said without turning. Osiah set the crate down. "Then we'll speak to the preacher this Sunday." She turned to him, her eyes full of quiet certainty. "I don't need a big gathering. Just a name shared and the truth of it spoken." "I'll speak it," he said. "And I'll live it." She crossed the room and laid her hand against his chest. "Then I reckon I've found my forever home." He closed his hand over hers and neither of them looked away. The preacher stood beneath the cottonwood tree behind the chapel, his voice steady against the hush of the late October air. A few neighbors gathered in coats and shawls, breath misting in the cool morning. The ground was hardening beneath them, the grass dull with the seasons turning. Grace stood in a dress she'd sewn from unbleached muslin, simple but clean, her ribbon tucked at her waist. Osiah had combed his hair and worn his stitched boots, the ones he kept oiled for Sundays. They held hands, fingers laced, and neither looked away when the preacher asked if they would cleave to one another in hardship and grace. "I do," Osiah said first, his voice low but certain. Grace's reply was quiet, but it carried across the field like a bell. "I do." There was no music, no fanfare. Just the sound of wind moving through dry leaves and the creak of the preacher's Bible closing. When Osiah leaned in to kiss her, her eyes closed before his lips met hers. Afterward, the neighbors left behind a basket of preserves and a folded quilt. Grace pressed one hand to the stitching. "It's Dutch star pattern," she said. "My mother had one just like this." Osiah helped her into the wagon. "Then it belongs here." They drove home slowly, the wagon quiet except for the creak of the wheels and the rustle of the basket between them. Her hand stayed on his leg the whole way, not out of show but because it felt right. That night, they cooked together in the warm light of the kitchen, Grace stirring cornmeal while Osiah sliced salt pork with the new blade he'd bought in town. After supper, he lit the lamp and drew the curtains she'd finished sewing 2 days before. The lavender threads caught the glow, softening the corners of the room, making everything feel closer. Grace hung her shawl on the back of the chair. "I'd like to fix up the barn loft," she said. "It's warmer than the shed and we'll need a space for drying herbs once I start collecting." "You planning to grow more than carrots and beans?" "I've been reading about tinctures," she said. "If I can get my hands on elderflower and comfrey, I could start small. Maybe trade what I make." Osiah leaned back in his chair. "You've got a mind for building things. Could be you'll end up with a whole apothecary out there. If I do, it'll have your name beside mine." He reached across the table, took her hand. "Whatever comes next, I'm standing in it with you." Before bed, he stoked the fire and checked the window latch. She stood in her nightdress, brushing out her hair with quiet purpose. When he crossed the room to her, she didn't step back. He touched her wrist first, then her waist, and when she looked up, her eyes were steady. "I've never been a man who needed much," he said. "But I've never wanted something more than I want this life with you." She laid her hand against his chest. "Then take it." They came together with the ease of two people who had already chosen each other long before this moment. There was no urgency, just the slow unfolding of trust, of warmth earned in the shadow of loss. When they lay together in the hush after, the firelight flickered against the walls and the world beyond the windows fell quiet. Winter came early that year. Snow blanketed the fields before November was out. Grace's garden went still beneath the frost, but she'd already hung bundles of dried herbs from the rafters and filled 6 jars with syrup that smelled of mint and bark. Osiah built shelves in the back room and she lined them carefully, labeling each one in her tidy handwriting. He watched her from the doorway, a mug of coffee in his hand, wondering how the house had ever felt full before she arrived. They shared the work without speaking much of it. When he mended the barn roof, she hauled nails and steadied the ladder. When she boiled liniment, he split kindling and warmed water for the wash. One morning in late February, she stood at the stove longer than usual, her hand resting on the edge of the table. He came behind her, slid his arms around her waist. "You're quiet," he said. She leaned back into him. "I think I'm with child." He stilled, then turned her gently. "You sure?" "I've counted 3 times," she said. "And I've been feeling it like something's different in me." He didn't speak at first. Just pressed his forehead to hers, their breath mingling. "I'll carve the cradle myself," he said. She laughed softly, her eyes filling. Just make sure it doesn't rock too hard. In the spring, he began shaping the wood. He chose pine from the stand west of the creek, the same place where he'd once watched her brush her fingers over the tall grass, naming plants he'd never noticed before. Grace planted early this time onions, squash, sweet peas, and told him the soil felt richer now. By the time the sun sat high and full again, her belly curved beneath her apron. She walked slower, but she never stopped. He brought her wild strawberries one afternoon, and she pressed them flat between biscuits, laughing when the juice stained her fingertips. One evening, just before the first hay cutting, she leaned into him while they watched the ridge go gold. "I used to think I'd have to build a life from scraps," she said. "Now it feels like I've got a whole one, laid straight and solid." Osiah kissed the crown of her head. "That's because you made it so." The baby came on a warm night in early July, when the stars hung low and bright. Their neighbor, Mrs. Ellison, midwifed the birth while Osiah waited just outside the room, hands tight on his knees. When the cry came sharp, insistent, and alive, he stood too fast and had to brace himself against the doorframe. Mrs. Ellison brought him in, and Grace looked up from the bed, pale but smiling, a tiny bundle in her arms. "It's a girl," she said. Osiah crossed the room and knelt beside them. The baby's skin was flushed and wrinkled, her fists curled tight against her chest. Grace looked down at her daughter, then at the man beside her. "Her name is Clara." His voice caught in his throat. "She's perfect." They raised her in the same house where Grace had once stood crying on a train platform, and Osiah had once eaten beans alone through the winter. The years passed slow and kind. The garden grew. The barn stayed full. And each night, after the lamps were turned low and Clara lay sleeping in her cradle, they held each other the way they always had, without fear, without doubt. Together. Always.